In the last quarter of the 17th century, a series of crises rocked the European colonies of North America. Social and political tensions boiled over in sometimes ruthless conflicts between rich and poor, free and slave, settler and Indian, and members of different religious groups. At the same time, struggles within and between European empires echoed in the colonies. Aggrieved groups seized upon the language of freedom to advance their goals. Although each conflict had its own local causes, taken together they added up to a general crisis of colonial society in the area that would become the United States. The bloodiest and most bitter conflict occurred in southern New England, where in 1675 an Indian alliance launched attacks on farms and settlements that were encroaching on Indian lands. It was the most dramatic and violent warfare in the region in the entire 17th century. New Englanders described the Wampanoag leader Metacom, known to the colonists as King Philip, as the uprising's mastermind, although in fact most tribes fought under their own leaders. By this time, the white population considerably outnumbered the Indians, but the fate of the New England colonies hung in the balance for several months. By 1676, Indian forces had attacked nearly half of New England's 90 towns. 12 in Massachusetts were destroyed. As refugees fled eastward, the line of settlement was pushed back almost to the Atlantic coast. Some 1,000 settlers out of a population of 52,000 and 3,000 of New England's 20,000 Indians perished in the fighting. In mid-1676, the tide of battle turned and a ferocious counterattack broke the Indians' power once and for all. Although the uprising united numerous tribes, others remained loyal to the colonists. The role of the Iroquois in providing essential military aid to the colonists helped to solidify their developing alliance with the government of New York. Together, colonial and Indian forces inflicted devastating punishment on the rebels. Metacom was captured and executed, Indian villages were destroyed, and captives, including men, women, and children, were killed or sold into slavery in the West Indies. Most of the survivors fled to Canada or New York. Even the praying Indians, about 2,000 Indians who had converted to Christianity and lived in autonomous communities under Puritan supervision, suffered. Removed from their towns to Deer Island in Boston Harbor, supposedly for their own protection, many perished from disease and lack of food. Both sides committed atrocities in this merciless conflict, but in its aftermath, the image of Indians as bloodthirsty savages became firmly entrenched in the New England mind. In the long run, King Philip's War produced a broadening of freedom for white New Englanders by expanding their access to land. But this freedom rested on the final dispossession of the region's Indians. As the New World became a battleground in European nations' endless contests for wealth and power, England moved to seize control of Atlantic trade, solidify its hold on North America's eastern coast, and exert greater control over its empire. By the middle of the 17th century, it was apparent that the colonies could be an important source of wealth for the mother country. According to the prevailing theory known as mercantilism, the government should regulate economic activity so as to promote national power. It should encourage manufacturing and commerce by special bounties, monopolies, and other measures. Above all, trade should be controlled so that more gold and silver flowed into the country than left it. That is, exports of goods, which generated revenue from abroad, should exceed imports, which required paying foreigners for their products. In the mercantilist outlook, the role of colonies was to serve the interests of the mother country by producing marketable raw materials and importing manufactured goods from home. Foreign Trade, declared an influential work written in 1664 by a London merchant, formed the basis of England's treasure. Commerce, not territorial plunder, was the foundation of empire. Under Oliver Cromwell, Parliament passed in 1651 the First Navigation Act, which aimed to wrest control of world trade from the Dutch, whose merchants profited from free trade with all parts of the world and all existing empires. Additional measures followed in 1660 and 1663. England's new economic policy, mercantilism, rested on the idea that England should monopolize the profits arising from the English Empire. According to the navigation laws, certain enumerated goods, essentially the most valuable colonial products such as tobacco and sugar, had to be transported in English ships and sold initially in English ports, although they could then be re-exported to foreign markets. Similarly, Most European goods imported into the colonies had to be shipped through England, where customs duties were paid. This enabled English merchants, manufacturers, shipbuilders, and sailors to reap the benefits of colonial trade and the government to enjoy added income from taxes. As members of the empire, American colonies would profit as well, since their ships were considered English. Indeed, the Navigation Act stimulated the rise of New England's shipbuilding industry. The restoration of the English monarchy when Charles II assumed the throne in 1660 sparked a new period of colonial expansion. The government chartered new trading ventures, notably the Royal African Company, which was given a monopoly of the slave trade. Within a generation, the number of English colonies in North America doubled. First to come under English control was New Netherland, seized in 1664 during an Anglo-Dutch war that also saw England gain control of Dutch trading posts in Africa. Charles II awarded the colony to his younger brother James, the Duke of York, with full and absolute power to govern as he pleased. Hence, the colony's name became New York. New Netherland had always remained peripheral to the far-flung Dutch Empire. The Dutch fought to retain their holdings in Africa, Asia, and South America, but they surrendered New Netherland in 1664 without a fight. English rule transformed this minor military base into an important imperial outpost, a seaport trading with the Caribbean and Europe, and a launching pad for military operations against the French. New York's European population, around 9,000 when the English assumed control, rose to 20,000 by 1685. English rule expanded the freedom of some New Yorkers, while reducing that of others. Many English observers had concluded that Dutch prosperity, what one writer called the prodigious increase of the Netherlanders in their domestic and foreign trade, stemmed from their toleration of different opinions in matters of religion, which attracted many industrious people of other countries. Thus, the terms of surrender guaranteed that the English would respect the religious beliefs and property holdings of the colony's many ethnic communities. But English law ended the Dutch tradition by which married women conducted business in their own name. As colonists of Dutch origin adapted to English rule, their wills directed more attention to advancing the fortunes of their sons than providing for their wives and daughters. There had been many female traders in New Amsterdam, often widows who had inherited a deceased husband's property, but few remained by the end of the 17th century. The English also introduced more restrictive attitudes toward blacks. In colonial New York City, as in New Amsterdam, those residents who enjoyed the status of freemen, obtained by birth in the city or by an act of local authorities, enjoyed special privileges, including the right to work in various trades. But the English, in a reversal of Dutch practice, expelled free blacks from many skilled jobs. Others benefited enormously from English rule. The Duke of York and his appointed governors continued the Dutch practice of awarding immense land grants to favorites, including 160,000 acres to Robert Livingston and 90,000 to Frederick Philipps. By 1700, nearly 2 million acres of land were owned by only 5 New York families who intermarried regularly, exerted considerable political influence, and formed one of colonial America's most tightly knit landed elites. Initially, English rule also strengthened the position of the Iroquois Confederacy of upstate New York. After a complex series of negotiations in the mid-1670s, Sir Edmund Andros, who had been appointed governor of New York after fighting the French in the Caribbean, formed an alliance known as the Covenant Chain, in which the imperial ambitions of the English and Indians reinforced one another. The 5, later 6, Iroquois nations assisted Andros in clearing parts of New York of rival tribes and helped the British in attacks on the French and their Indian allies. Andros, for his part, recognized the Iroquois claim to authority over Indian communities in the vast area stretching to the Ohio River. But beginning in the 1680s, Indians around the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley regrouped and with French aid attacked the Iroquois, pushing them to the east. By the end of the century, the Iroquois nations adopted a policy of careful neutrality, seeking to play the European empires off one another while continuing to profit from the fur trade. Many colonists, meanwhile, began to complain that they were being denied the liberties of Englishmen, especially the right to consent to taxation. There had been no representative assembly under the Dutch, and the governors appointed by the Duke of York at first ruled without one. Discontent was especially strong on Long Island, which had been largely settled by New Englanders used to self-government. In 1683, the Duke agreed to call an elected assembly whose first act was to draft a charter of liberties and privileges. The charter required that elections be held every 3 years among male property owners and the freemen of New York City. It also reaffirmed traditional English rights, such as trial by jury and security of property, as well as religious toleration for all Protestants. In part, the charter reflected an effort by newer English colonists to assert dominance over older Dutch settlers by establishing the principle that the liberties to which New Yorkers were entitled were those enjoyed by Englishmen at home. For more than 3 decades after the establishment of Maryland in 1632, no new English settlement was planted in North America. Then, in 1663, Charles II awarded to 8 proprietors the right to establish a colony to the north of Florida as a barrier to Spanish expansion. Not until 1670 did the first settlers arrive to found Carolina. In its early years, Carolina was the colony of a colony. It began as an offshoot of the tiny island of Barbados. In the mid-17th century, Barbados was the Caribbean's richest plantation economy, but a shortage of available land led wealthy planters to seek opportunities in Carolina for their sons. The early settlers of Carolina sought Indian allies by offering guns for deer hides and captives, a policy that unleashed widespread raiding among Indians for slaves to sell. The colonists also encouraged native allies to attack Indians in Spanish Florida. In one series of wars between 1704 and 1706, the Creek, Savannah, and Yamasee enslaved almost 10,000 Florida Indians, most of them shipped to other mainland colonies in the West Indies. Indeed, between 1670 and 1720, the number of Indian slaves exported from Charleston was larger than the number of African slaves imported. In 1715, the Yamasee and Creek, alarmed by the enormous debts they had incurred in trade with the settlers and by slave traders' raids into their territory, rebelled. The Yamasee uprising was crushed, and most of the remaining Indians were enslaved or driven out of the colony into Spanish Florida, from where they occasionally launched raids against English settlements. The Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina, issued by the proprietors in 1669, proposed to establish a feudal society with a hereditary nobility, with strange titles like landgraves and caciques, serfs, and slaves. Needing to attract settlers quickly, however, the proprietors also provided for an elected assembly and religious toleration, by now recognized as essential to enticing migrants to North America. They also instituted a generous headright system, offering 150 acres for each member of an arriving family. In the case of indentured servants, of course, the land went to the employer, and 100 acres to male servants who completed their terms. None of the baronies envisioned in the fundamental constitutions were actually established. Slavery, not feudalism, made Carolina an extremely hierarchical society. The proprietors instituted a rigorous legal code that promised slave owners absolute power and authority over their human property and included imported slaves in the headright system. This allowed any persons who settled in Carolina and brought with them slaves, including planters from Barbados, instantly to acquire large new land holdings. In its early days, however, the economy centered on cattle raising and trade with local Indians, not agriculture. Carolina grew slowly until planters discovered the staple, rice, that would make them the wealthiest elite in English North America and their colony an epicenter of mainland slavery. The last English colony to be established in the 17th century was Pennsylvania. The proprietor, William Penn, envisioned it as a place where those facing religious persecution in Europe could enjoy spiritual freedom, and colonists and Indians would coexist in harmony. Penn's late father had been a supporter and creditor of Charles II. To cancel his debt to the Penn family and bolster the English presence in North America, the king, in 1681, granted Penn a vast tract of land south and west of New York, as well as the old Swedish-Dutch colony that became Delaware. A devout member of the Society of Friends, or Quakers, Penn was particularly concerned with establishing a refuge for his co-religionists who faced increasing persecution in England. He had already assisted a group of English Quakers in purchasing half of what became the colony of New Jersey from Lord John Berkeley, who had received a land grant from the Duke of York. Penn was largely responsible for the frame of government announced in 1677, the West Jersey Concessions, one of the most liberal of the era. Based on Quaker ideals, it created an elected assembly with a broad suffrage and established religious liberty. Penn hoped that West Jersey would become a society of small farmers, not large landowners. Like the Puritans, Penn considered his colony a holy experiment, but of a different kind, a free colony for all mankind that should go hither. He hoped that Pennsylvania could be governed according to Quaker principles, among them the equality of all persons, including women, blacks, and Indians, before God, and the primacy of the individual conscience. To Quakers, liberty was a universal entitlement, not the possession of any single people, a position that would eventually make them the first group of whites to repudiate slavery. Penn also treated Indians with a consideration unique in the colonial experience, purchasing land before reselling it to colonists and offering refuge to tribes driven out of other colonies by warfare. Sometimes he even purchased the same land twice, when more than one Indian tribe claimed it. Since Quakers were pacifists who came to America unarmed and did not even organize a militia until the 1740s, peace with the native population was essential. Penn's chain of friendship appealed to the local Indians, promising protection from rival tribes who claimed domination over them. Religious freedom was Penn's most fundamental principle. He condemned attempts to enforce religious uniformity for depriving thousands of free inhabitants of England of the right to worship as they desired. His Charter of Liberty, approved by the Assembly in 1682, offered Christian liberty to all who affirmed a belief in God and did not use their freedom to promote licentiousness. There was no established church in Pennsylvania, and attendance at religious services was entirely voluntary, although Jews were barred from office by a required oath affirming belief in the divinity of Jesus Christ. At the same time, the Quakers upheld a strict code of personal morality. Penn's frame of government prohibited swearing, drunkenness, and adultery, as well as popular entertainments of the era such as revels, bull baiting, and cockfighting. Private religious belief may not have been enforced by the government, but moral public behavior certainly was. Not religious uniformity, but a virtuous citizenry would be the foundation of Penn's social order. Given the power to determine the colony's form of government, Penn established an appointed council to originate legislation and an assembly elected by male taxpayers and freemen, owners of 100 acres of land for free immigrants and 50 acres for former indentured servants. These rules made a majority of the male population eligible to vote. Penn owned all the colony's land and sold it to settlers at low prices rather than granting it outright. Like other proprietors, he expected to turn a profit, and like most of them, he never really did. But if Penn did not prosper, Pennsylvania did. A majority of the early settlers were Quakers from the British Isles. But Pennsylvania's religious toleration, healthy climate, and inexpensive land, along with Penn's aggressive efforts to publicize the colony's advantages, soon attracted immigrants from all over Western Europe. Ironically, the freedoms Pennsylvania offered to European immigrants contributed to the deterioration of freedom for others. The colony's successful efforts to attract settlers would eventually come into conflict with Penn's benevolent Indian policy. And the opening of Pennsylvania led to an immediate decline in the number of indentured servants choosing to sail for Virginia and Maryland, a development that did much to shift those colonies toward reliance on slave labor.